Section 15-3. Darwin presents his case. Publication of On the Origin of Species. Darwin filled notebooks with his ideas about species diversity in the evolution process. Darwin was stunned and disturbed by his discoveries. He shelved his manuscripts for years and told his wife to publish it in case he died. In 1858, Darwin received a short essay from naturalist Alfred Wallace. The essay surmised Darwin's thoughts on evolutionary change. Later that year, Wallace's essay was presented with some of Darwin's work. In 1859, Darwin published his book On the Origin of Species. In his book, Darwin proposed a mechanism for evolution called natural selection, presented evidence that evolution has been taking place for millions of years and continues in all living things. Inherited variation and artificial selection. Members of each species vary from one another in important ways. In Darwin's day, variations were thought to be unimportant, minor defects. Darwin argued that this variation mattered. Darwin noted that plant and animal breeders would breed only the largest hogs, the fastest horses, or the cows that produce the most milk. Darwin termed this process artificial selection. Key concept number 1. How is natural variation used in artificial selection? Artificial selection is the selection by humans for breeding of useful traits from the natural variation among different organisms. As you can see here, we have Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, and broccoli, and kale. Okay? Kale, these are all greens, and kohlrabi. All right. So what I'm assuming here is that after years of this variation and artificial selection, from one plant, they were able to make 5 different plants. Evolution by natural selection. Darwin compared processes in nature to artificial selection. By doing so, he developed a scientific hypothesis to explain how evolution occurs. The struggle for existence. Darwin realized that high birth rates and a shortage of life's basic needs would force organisms to compete for resources. The struggle for existence means that members of each species compete regularly to obtain food, living space, and other necessities of life. The struggle for existence was central to Darwin's theory of evolution. Key concept number 2. How is natural selection related to a species' fitness? Survival of the fittest. The ability of an individual to survive and reproduce in its specific environment is fitness. Darwin proposed that fitness is the result of adaptations. An adaptation is any inherited characteristic that increases an organism's chance of survival. Successful adaptations enable organisms to become better suited to their environment and better able to survive and reproduce. Individuals with characteristics that are not well suited to their environment either die or leave few offspring. Individuals that are better suited to their environment survive and reproduce most successfully. Darwin called this process survival of the fittest. Because of its similarities to artificial selection, Darwin referred to this survival of the fittest as natural selection. In natural selection, the traits being selected contribute to an organism's fitness in its environment. Key concept number 3. Over time, natural selection results in... No, this is the answer to key concept number 2. Over time, natural selection results in changes in the inherited characteristics of a population. These changes increase a species' fitness in its environment. Descent with modification. Natural selection produces organisms that have different structures, establish different niches, or occupy different habitats. Each living species has descended with changes from other species over time. Darwin referred to this principle as descent with modification. Descent with modification implies that all living organisms are related to one another. This is the principle known as common descent. Key concept number 3. What evidence of evolution did Darwin present? Darwin argued that living things have been evolving on Earth for millions of years. Evidence for this process could be found in the fossil record, the geographical distribution of living species, homologous structures of living organisms, and similarities in early development or embryology. The fossil record. Darwin saw fossils as a record of the history of life on Earth. By comparing fossils from older rock layers with fossils from younger layers, scientists could document that life on Earth has changed over time. Geographical distribution of living species. Darwin decided that all Galapagos finches could have descended with modification from a common mainland ancestor. Darwin's theory was that species now living on different continents had each descended from different ancestors. However, because some animals on each continent were living under similar ecological conditions, they were exposed to similar pressures of natural selection. Because of these similar selection pressures, different animals ended up evolving certain features in common. Similar but unrelated species. Okay, you can look at them. We've got the beaver, the muskrat, the copu, and the capybara. Okay, now this right here is like, these are found in South America. Okay, so you see the coipu, which is right here, which I think the coipu has actually made it into the Everglades right now and is destroying South Florida, so they hunt them to get them out. The coipu, which looks like a mouse, similar to a mouse, lives in this area of South America right here. Okay, the capybara lives in the northern continent of South America. Then they both occupy this area right here. And this right here, if I'm not mistaken, this is Brazil. And this right here is Argentina down in here. And then up here is Colombia and the other South American countries. Okay, now up here, where we're familiar with, this is the beaver and this is the muskrat, right? So the muskrat by itself, without the beaver, is isolated to the west. And then there's beaver out in the west too. And then you see there's beaver in Texas and northern Mexico. And then you see there is beaver in southern Carolina and western North Carolina, all the way into Georgia, all the way down into South Alabama. Okay, now the beaver and muskrat together are found all throughout the United States here and in Canada. And then at the very tip of Alaska up here, which is what this is, and then this is Dutch Harbor and all the islands, this is the muskrat territory. Okay, so see, they're similar, but they're unrelated species. Homologous body structures that have different mature forms but develop from the same embryonic tissues, are called homologous structures. I'm sure that is one of the answers to the worksheet. So, similarities and differences in homologous structures help biologists group animals according to how recently they last shared a common ancestor. Okay, so here's some examples of the homologous structure. Okay, now this is a turtle leg, this is an alligator leg, this is a bird's wing, and then this is a mammal. Okay, which would be like a dog or, okay, and then this is an ancient lobe of a finned fish. Now, you can see they're very similar structures, right, with similar parts. It just shows you how they've evolved over time differently for the different ecosystems and niches that they've lived in. Not all homologous structures serve important functions. The organs of many animals are so reduced in size they are just vestiges or traces of organs in other species. These organs are called vestigial organs. The early stages or embryos of many animals with backbones are very similar. The same groups of embryonic cells develop in the same order and in similar patterns to produce the tissues and organs of all vertebrates. Okay, the summary of Darwin's theory. Individual organisms differ, and some of this variation is heritable, all right, which means it's passed on to the offspring. Organisms produce more offspring than can survive, and many that do survive do not reproduce. Because more organisms are produced than can survive, they compete for limited resources, which are food, water, shelter, and stuff like that. Individuals best suited to their environment survive and reproduce most successfully. These organisms pass their heritable traits to their offspring. Other individuals die or leave fewer offspring. This process of natural selection causes species to change over time. Species alive today are descended with modification from ancestral species that lived in the distant past. This process by which diverse species evolved from common ancestors unites all organisms on Earth into a single tree of life. Strengths and weaknesses of evolutionary theory. Scientific advances in many fields of biology, geology, and physics have confirmed and expanded most of Darwin's hypotheses. Evolutionary theory continues to change as new data are gathered and new ways of thinking arise. Section quiz. The scientist who motivated Darwin to publish on the origin of species was Alfred Russel Wallace. Number 2, differences among individuals of a single species are referred to as B, genetic variation. Changes that increase a species' fitness in its environment over time are due to natural selection. An inherited characteristic that survives an organism's chance of survival is called an adaptation. Evidence used by Darwin to support the idea of evolution included all of the following except the genetic mechanism by which useful traits are inherited. This is the end of our section.